Thanks everyone for joining us for our next Ripple Ventures Tank Talk with Ade Ajao, Managing Partner of Base10 Partners, to discuss how to invest in automation and AI tools that transform legacy industries. Thanks for joining us in the tank today, Ade.
Thank you very much, Matt. Very happy to be here.
Now, just a brief background on Ade. As I mentioned, Ade is the managing partner of Base10, where he's been for the last 3 years. Base10 is an early stage venture capital firm investing in the automation of the real economy. They have raised 2 funds so far, and their latest being a Base10 Partners 2 fund at $250 million. Prior to that, Ade was a VP of technology and product strategy at Workday for 2 years, where he had a hand in launching Workday Ventures, the first applied AI focused fund. Prior to that, he was the co-founder and CEO of Identified for 3 years, which was a data and analytics program acquired by Workday. Ade was also the co-founder and CEO of 20 from 2005 to 2010. 20 was started in college with 2 friends, and it quickly became the social phenomenon known as the Spanish Facebook, before being acquired by Telefonica for $100 million. On the angel investment side, Ade is a founding investor of Cabify, the largest ride-sharing service in Latin America, and he's also an investor in Docsend, DollarShave Club, Instacart, and over 20 other angel investments. I'd love to kick things off and talk about your operating journey, Ade. Can you tell us about your operator journey starting out as the co-founder and CEO of 20 and the lessons you learned about building and scaling a startup in an extremely competitive space?
Absolutely, Matt. Thank you. So 20 was now almost 16 years ago. I was still back in college, still had hair. And one of the good things about that is that there are a lot of lessons to learn, because I think we did a couple of things very right, but otherwise everything basically wrong, which is what you will expect from 22, 23-year-old Spanish kids that had no exposure to startups whatsoever. And I will say that the things that we did well were recognizing early that social networking was a megatrend, 2004, 2005, which wasn't as obvious. And it definitely wasn't obvious that those websites were going to be real companies. I remember us trying to raise our first money in Spain in 2005, where there was no venture capital industry, and people looking at us and saying like, wait, if I got you right, you want money to run a website and you need an office to run that website? Wait, did you say you were from Nigeria? Is this a scam? And I literally heard that several times, because it was just absolutely unheard of. So I think we picked the right trend, and I think we definitely took a leap of faith in putting the right team and resources together, believing that that trend could be a business in our specific geography. Other than that, we built the right product for it. The product was extremely engaging. People spent on average 2 hours per day on the site, which was a lot back then, because again, it was before mobile. So people, were like in their computer. Eventually we had an iPhone app, but we did a lot of things wrong. We overhire. Once we had the money, we hire a lot of like MBA types with like finance and fancy experience that was absolutely not useful for something that it wasn't even a business yet. We had to redo 90% of things that we had originally built because they were not scalable. We did not plan for scalability. This site, there was a time in our second year where every Sunday this site will crash, because it's the time where people will upload pictures from their weekend, and we needed physical servers at that point, and we had not planned to put up enough servers to have that capacity. So a million things that we did wrong, but thankfully the team was strong, the product was strong, and a few years later we had a very significant exit that was very significant for all of us.
Well, you've obviously had millions of issues that you had to face, but some of the main ones, it sounds like, were one, having a thick skin to be able to take those, insults of, is this a scam? What the heck are you talking about? We don't give money to people who build websites, to continue pursuing, the problem you were trying to solve with a group of friends that had no idea what they were doing. And then after mistake after mistake, still keeping your head down and focused on building something that ended up working out pretty great, I'd say, considering you got acquired in 2010 by Telefonica for about $100 million US. Can you tell us what that experience was like, being acquired by one of the largest telephone operators globally, and the lessons you learned about M&A that you carry with you today?
Absolutely. You mentioned greed, and I absolutely agree that is the number one thing that an entrepreneur can have. I won't mention who, but one of my mentors in Silicon Valley, when I originally came here, told me, you know what entrepreneurship is? Look at that wall over there, knock your head against it 100 times. And if you still like it in 101, then like you want to be an entrepreneur. And like, I could not agree more. I was like, that is exactly my experience.
Yeah.
And has been ever since with absolutely everything. The M&A process was really interesting. At some point, this more like 07, 08, we did become the largest social network in Spain and actually had more traffic than Google and Facebook combined in the country in terms of page views. So it attracted a lot of attention. And it was about the time that the world was waking up to, oh, this Facebook thing can actually be a real business. There were still a ton of doubts that it was going to actually be a public company. And if you remember a lot of the commentary around the IPO, people were like, well, like this is not a real company. Wall Street hated it. They hated Mark Zuckerberg. When these team invested at a 10 billion valuation, they still thought, what are they doing? They have no idea what this is. So a lot to prove, but we have definitely proven that young people wanted to spend time. And that was very valuable to folks that wanted to have access to that young generation. And that is a rationale that, in my opinion, is out there in about a third of technology acquisitions. That is just a channel into that younger generation and probably more for consumer companies. So we made that front and center, and we had at least 3 different groups that were quite interesting. Negotiations with Telefonica took forever. There were like, 10 different people on the team involved. When I say forever, it's more than a year and closer to 2. Telefonica is a very large company. It's the largest in Spain. The joke within Spain is that it's a government within the country. It's a separate government. It's everywhere in the world, including Latin America. In the midst of it, they decided to launch their own social network that they call KTK. And because it was social, they did a big event in Madrid where they were like, well, what is the biggest social person that we can bring to make it popular? And they brought Paris Hilton. And that did not work out, surprisingly. And I think that was the point where they were like, you know what? We actually really need this. The one lesson I take away from the year is 2. One, understanding the structure of decision makers of your buyer, so you know with whom you are talking and what the whole stakeholder universe looks like. And 2, and it's even more important, is identifying what it is that you really have that they really want. Because again, it could be the user base, it could be the technology, it could be the brand, it could be capabilities, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, really understanding what the acquirer wants out of this transaction is really important, because you could be totally blindsided at the last minute thinking you have been selling them something that they really want. And then all of a sudden, when you don't have an answer to something that's really important to them, but you've kind of shuffled to the side, and all of a sudden they're like, well, you don't know what you're building in this department. That's what we really care about. So getting an understanding of what they really want is really important. I got to ask, who came up with Spanish Facebook? Was that the community? Was that yourselves? Was that an investor? And do you think Facebook really led the way for you to build this into a business? Or could you have done it on your own without them?
It was the community that came up with the Spanish Facebook. And it was, we weren't nicknamed like that at the beginning, because at the beginning, no one knew Facebook in Spain when we started. So, but eventually at Facebook became the behemoth that it is today. The comparison was obvious. I think that Facebook absolutely led the way for modern social networking. There were a number of social networks actually before Facebook, some of which provided more of an inspiration actually for 20. In fact, were closely modeled after a Swedish social network started in 2002 called Small World, that very few people in the US know or remember. But actually the biggest in Spain at the time was a site called High Five that was based here in San Francisco, and it had 80 million users worldwide. It just didn't really nail community and relevance in the way that Facebook did, and definitely in a lot of ways were indebted to them.
Well, obviously after selling 20, you got right back at it and you started Identified to create a better professional job search engine, and then pivoted to provide an analytics-based recruiting software. Identified raised over 20 million from investors and eventually went on to be acquired by Workday in 2014 as their first public acquisition. What drove you to pivot the business in the first place? And what lessons did you learn after pivoting before being acquired that you advise other startups considering the same move today?
So one of the things that I learned within 20 was the power of data. And, just very simple things like making the newsfeed relevant, which, back in the day was the driver was just like, hey, how do we make sure that the pictures that your friends share get the adequate number of likes so they stay engaged, right? Very simple problem. Who would have thought back in 2005 or 2006 that 14 years later, the conversation about the relevance of newsfeed will actually be parallel to democracy and free speech in certain countries, right? But, definitely not making that logical leap. I did think that there was power on using the data within social networks to provide more value to people in particular and society in general. And one of the areas where that struck me as more obvious was the job market. And the thinking was, hey, people already have social profiles. It will not take much to take some information from that and turn it into professional profiles. And then we can use those professional profiles in a way that is more rich than LinkedIn for the younger generation to make adequate recommendations of what could be a great path for that particular person based on their interests, capability, network, and same thing on the employer side. So we wanted to create a two-sided marketplace with users creating profiles, importing their social profiles, and then, a business on the recruiting side selling licenses to the companies. What I will say is the business on the company side was working great and employers were very interested. The technology, which was mostly focused around normalizing and ordering social data to make it relevant for professional purposes, also worked great. And what had less engagement was the social side. And, big surprise, people don't find applying to jobs as engaging as they do sharing pictures with their friends. And what we realized as well, actually, we don't really need to recreate that social network within another website because all that information is already out there. And increasingly, people are creating more and more social profiles. And a lot of that information, particularly the parts that we needed, that were things like job title, company you work at, educational background, are pretty plain vanilla to just get, and then the user can claim the profile. So we took that approach, eliminating the social part, and realized that we should have done that from the beginning. We were trying to do too much because that is when the business really took off.
Yeah, that's really interesting. A lot of founders set out on a mission thinking what their idea is originally is going to be this big home run. And it's hard to rip that baby away from them when there's a glowing, amazing opportunity right beside you, something like you were, focused on, which is the analytics and the data side, because you had maybe had your heart and soul invested in this initial idea of a social platform. But you obviously realized that because of 20 and realized, okay, we've done this social before. I saw where it got us, how long it took us to get there and so on. This is where I want to build the future, which is around the analytics and the data piece. Could you have built the data piece though right from the beginning, or did you need to kind of stumble through the learning lessons of the social part before you got to realize the data was the holy grail for you to build?
Looking back on it today, I think that we could have built the data piece from the beginning and will have made our life easier. Obviously, that's easy to say, right? Looking back, because I don't fully remember all the twists and turns we took. But I think that what you said before is absolutely true. And it's hard because by definition, when you're starting a company from scratch, generally you are not alone in your space, if the space has any value, right? So the founder mentality is such that you look around and you see billion-dollar companies like at the time LinkedIn or Career Builder or Indeed, and you are like, yeah, I can do better than everyone. And then, you are told a million times why your idea will not work. And to our prior point, you're like, whatever, I can do it. So by that logic, it's very hard to understand what part of what you believe you can do, you might actually be overextending. And I find that being able to very quickly take real feedback from what is working and is not working and apply that feedback in the most honest possible way and reprioritizing what's important for the overarching mission and keeping that balance of, okay, we have this big vision, but there are multiple ways we can get there. And we are going to see what works and what doesn't. That is really, to me, when I look at early stage companies, what I value the most probably on teams, because I have experienced firsthand how hard it is. And I don't think there's really a playbook
Yeah, I completely agree. I think any company that can pivot quickly based on relevant feedback, especially from like enterprise customers, and incorporate that into a brand new product or feature is way more impressive than someone who's hard-headed and trying to prove everyone wrong by sticking out on the same mission they had from the very beginning. I think the word pivot has some negative connotations to it that it shouldn't always have, especially if it's done quickly in the right way based on relevant feedback. So I completely agree with you. Well, I'd love to talk about your transition to venture capital. So after being acquired by Workday in 2014, you had a hand in starting Workday Ventures. You led their first 10 investments, including Jobber, which coincidentally was run by your now partner, TJ Nahigian. What excited you most about joining Workday Ventures, and what lessons did you learn about investing as a CVC that you still rely on today?
Absolutely. So, Workday gave me a great opportunity because by the time we Sol identified, I had been investing, as you mentioned before, personally quite a bit. I had decided that is what I wanted to do going forward. I had a lot of fun doing it. I also realized it is not very healthy to keep starting company after company after company. And I did not have a lot more hair to lose. So, for a number of reasons, I thought, next best thing is helping others from the very beginning. And I'm very much a 0 to 1, 0 to 10 person. So early stage investing is what I wanted to do. And when I expressed this to Workday, they were generous enough to be like, hey, we have been thinking about doing something within Workday for a while. And, Workday was this amazing company that had recently became public and was growing into having quite the ecosystem. And I think like a lot of companies that want to become platforms they start looking at the ecosystem and are like, well, there are some bets that we want to take here because it will either enhance our own ecosystem or because we have something to learn from these companies or because we could buy one of these companies. And they told me, are you interested in that? And is that something that you could do here? And I would say absolutely. So I feel blessed by that. Moreover, that's how I met TJ, right? Like TJ now is the person I see the most day to day, second to my wife, depending on the day. And we met because as one of the key areas for Workday was recruiting, I was looking and monitoring the recruiting space, and literally I saw Jobber in the iPhone store, and it quickly climbed to number 1 in business, and I downloaded it, and I actually think I wrote TJ over Jobber initially, and then I asked for an introduction, and I just showed up at his office. His round was actually closed, but I told him, hey, I'm not going to leave until you don't open the round for me and Workday. And Workday loved it, and we worked pretty well together.
Well, that entrepreneurial hustle by being an operator first and understanding, how to, one, convince someone inside a large corporate that just became public that this is something they should do, obviously was something that you took from your prior days of pounding your head against the wall 100 times until you wanted to do it the 101st time. But also, going out on your own, probably before the fund had even really formally set itself up, going out, finding great entrepreneurs, messaging through their own app, and then saying, hey, let's do a deal. I really believe in what you're doing. That's something that I'm sure a lot of corporate venture funds had not seen, especially, in early 2010, 2012 or so. So you probably brought a ton of fresh blood to Workday to focus on what now became what is known as one of the best, corporate VCs out there. So that must have been an unbelievable experience.
It was a great experience. And I am very thankful for, the bet that Workday took on me, because it is not straightforward for corporates to do something like this. And as you mentioned, more so with an entrepreneur that, by definition, we are a pain to be employed by anyone.
That's amazing. Well, it translated into what is now Base10 Ventures. In 2017, you went on to raise your first fund, which was 137 million. And then your most recent second fund was 250 million. Can you explain more about your thesis on automation and how it's different than all the other B2B SaaS investors out there?
Absolutely. It's ironic that the origin of my relationship with TJ was me as the investor and he as the entrepreneur, given that I actually have more experience as an entrepreneur and he has a lot more experience than me as an investor, having been in Summit Partners, Excel Partners, and Kutu. It was funny because originally his office in Jobber was like 2 blocks from Workday. So I will actually go to their office quite a bit. And generally, I had spent the past 4 years at Identified building data science stuff. Before it was really like, the whole data ML thing. It was more like 2013, 2014, and we started in 2009. And TJ was getting increasingly a lot of challenges around that, like every company that is amassing a lot of data. So he will ping me to work on data science stuff. And every time I went to the office, I was like, hey, by the way, I'm thinking of investing in these 3 companies. What do you think? And then he will give me like his investor due diligence. And consistently, I was like, man, this guy gets it. It's like, I know a lot of GPs out there. And like, this guy is so Cartesian. And, I think one of the things that make Tia and I work well together is that we're incredibly different. And that is true for everyone at Base10. I fall in love with ideas and people, ambition and narrative. And Tia is like absolutely impervious to narrative. He's like extremely Cartesian and evaluating a business, which was a great compliment to me. So when he sold Jobber, which was Workday Ventures' first exit, I asked him, hey, so what do you plan to do? He said, well, I was an investor. I've always been an investor. I want to go back to investing, and I'm probably going to go back to Cotu. I have a great relationship with the guys there. And I was like, sure, I have a better idea. So I've been wanting to do this fund. And, I think there are a lot of funds that when I was raising money for Identified back in the day, they were focused on the early stage. And now they are like multi-stage, multi-billion funds. And I don't think that you can write $5 million checks in the morning and $50 million checks in the evening and do it equally well. So I think that there is a space for new entrants in the early stage. And, you and I have been talking about what is next for tech in general. And we both were helping on that thesis that we now call automation for a real economy. But the way I illustrate it is the following. When I was at Workday, I was also still involved with Cabify, ride-sharing company in Latam that I was founding investor of. And I remember one particular day where, there were one big day at Workday in terms of, we are competing with this other big SaaS provider for this big contract. These are high stakes. And that's high stakes, right? For a company like Workday on SaaS. And then I talked to the Cabify folks and they're like, man, a Mexican cartel is essentially using the taxi drivers to like set our cars on fire. And I think they're trying to kidnap some of our drivers. And I was like, well, that is a very different high stakes. And, that fundamentally illustrates that what Workday does is amazing. And, it's similar to what Salesforce does or Oracle does. But companies that are touching the real world, like Airbnb, like Instacart, like Flexport, like Opendoor, they have a very different class of problems. And they have to do with regulation, of working with governments, of being in industries that are highly regulated, like healthcare, or dealing with different kind of workers, a lot more blue collar workers or quote unquote gig workers, etc. They're dealing with assets, warehouses, etc., etc., etc. And in our view, all that was a new universe that would have automation for the real economy. And the easiest way to think about it is problems for the 99%. It's like, what are things, because HR software is not a problem for 99%. Eating or like moving from one place to the other is. Agriculture is. Real estate is. So when you think about those big problems that are going to affect everyone in the planet, that should be solved partially by technology and automation, how does that look like? And can you make an early stage VC firm completely focus on those set of problems? And that is how Tia and I, became very excited about this particular vision.
Yeah, absolutely love that. I love the organic nature in which you and TJ came together, just bouncing ideas off each other. You had a very yin and yang approach to looking at companies very differently, but that's what you want in a partner, someone who challenges you and brings a totally different mindset to the problem. And then also explaining your thesis of this real economy needs to benefit from technology as well. But all these investors who are writing 5 million checks in the morning, 50 million in the evening, they can't do it. And they're all focused on this digital economy, but nobody's really focused on the online to offline, which is sort of similar to what we focus on at Ripple. We say, you can't sell to the steak and handshake crowd that is in logistics and trucking the same way you sell digital software to, you say an HR solutions business, but they still need to be informed about it and eventually adopt it. So how do you do that? And that translates to the topic today, which is how to invest in automation and AI tools that transform legacy industries. So over the last decade, we've seen a huge surge in automation tools. You even stated that you expect $4 trillion of the economy will be automated over the next decade. Are there certain sectors categories or even functions that you think will be more readily adopt automation solutions in the next few years?
Absolutely, we do. And, obviously we have to review even our definition of sectors and function every few months because things are moving thus far, right? And to give you a concrete example, we love logistics and we think logistics is a sector where there will be a lot of automation on a number of things and it will actually be great. Like one of the great things about helping automate logistics is that it is one of the best ways to reduce carbon footprint worldwide. Like literally, if you just focus on real estate and logistics, you will solve at least half the problem. Anyway, when we originally started with Base10, we're like, logistics is totally going to be a vertical and we're going to do a lot there. And then today we have, I think, 17 different sub-verticals in logistics alone. And they go from food logistics that has another 3 sub-verticals within to things like unloading of cargo imports. And you just realize the magnitude of those problems. And that is when you take the industry lens. Another is the horizontal lens, right? Like you mentioned functions, it's like, customer service. There is a lot that can be done in customer service automation. And then you realize that for restaurants and for healthcare practices, that can mean related but quite different things. So one of the common themes that arises from that is that we have definitely learned that, when it comes to understanding real economy industries, historically, we haven't been that great at that. And that is why actually doing real work in researching what is going on and be able to, learn often in public and redefine what you think you understood about a particular industry is core to the way we do things.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of VCs use like the TAM as their filter. And sometimes when you're doing TAM, you look at it a very horizontal lens. But if you do what you guys are doing, where you go very vertical and you realize maybe from a bottoms up perspective, when you start to layer the functions in that one sector on top of each other, that TAM becomes enormous within that very sliver part of the category of the sector you're focused on, which may, result in huge opportunities that you guys can invest in, and hopefully we can as well at Ripple, because we don't focus on that top-down approach to looking at the size of a market. What do you think about that?
I think that you're spot on, Matt, and I think we look at the world in a very similar way. I remember this was about 2 years ago when I was trying to do some research on back office automation for a number of vertical industries, like, lawn care and travel agencies and schooling and a few others. And, the traditional time conclusion was none of those industries has enough of an IT budget to spend in software tools for back office, so it's not going to be that big. And then my partner Reggie took a second and much better look and said, hey, you are massively underestimating this, because when you look at specific use cases here, you cannot really disentangle back office from payments. Like it all has to be the same work, the same flow to work in this particular industry. And then you are getting in the middle of the transaction. And when you look at the TAM of what could be as a percentage of transaction, you are getting to a totally different answer. I'm like, that's absolutely right. And that is not true for every vertical. Again, it has to be bottoms up. In other cases, I think that is true for things like embedded payroll. So it really has to be this bottoms up, sector by sector, and you can know it all, right? And it's going to evolve. So I think our industry is itself undergoing an interesting transition, because I wonder how many firms are going to be willing to change the way they do things in that sense.
Yeah, well, hopefully not before me and you get to those companies first, but we'll
agree.
save that for another day. So at Base10, you focus on several industries, including real estate, construction, agriculture, and logistics, which you just mentioned. Which of these areas are you most excited / interested in that you have yet to invest in?
One of the top ones yet to invest in, we have made one investment, but it's very small, is in construction, right? Like one of the biggest industries on the planet, definitely like top of mind for carbon footprint reduction. I recently was told by a construction industry executive that in industrial construction in the US, about 30% of materials are stored away and never used for every industrial project. I just think about that alone in terms of waste. And by the way, the technology to solve that, that was invented in the 90s and put to the cloud in the mid 2000s. It's not a technology problem. It's an adoption problem. And as you said before, in a lot of these industries, the risk is not technology risk, it's adoption risk. So I am hoping that the next decade is going to see a lot of further adoption by the construction industry of technology, but it is going to take a while for a number of reasons.
Yeah, well, I think COVID has definitely accelerated that. I mean, one of our first investments is a company called Tread Technologies, which is focused on the aggregates and dump truck industry for collection of waste from job sites. And what I was astonished by when I learned about the problem they were solving was that the North American dump truck industry was 3 times the size of the taxi industry, but the average size dump truck operator only owned 3 trucks. So it was so fragmented and none of them talked to each other. And they were all on this sort of mom and pop kind of phone fax machine system for connecting with people that you wanted to come to your job site. And that's an example of that bottoms up approach, understanding the problems and the magnitude of it from the very bottom of the supply chain, which it sounds like you're excited about solving as well at Base10 in the construction space.
Absolutely.
So the 2 forms of automation are process automation and automated decision-making, i.e. AI. How does your team due diligence startups differently who are building either of these automation tools? And what are the key attributes you look for in AI startups that may be not generating any revenue from their decision-making software just yet?
AI has become such a pernicious term, I think, in our industry for overuse, right? And in general, right? Like, I think we're all at fault here, including media in general and fiction, because it's a bucket where, you put everything from Spotify to Skynet. In general, when we invest is very early, like you, and oftentimes there is not a lot there yet. And our general view is that AI as a technology, the math of it, if you wish, is actually going to be pretty commoditized, developed by a few large players, and generally is going to be public knowledge. So what is going to actually be valuable is the specific use case. And again, that requires a bottoms-up approach. And in particular, understanding, okay, for that specific use case that you are trying to solve in, let's say, reducing the waste of construction sites, how important and how valued is that decision-making recommendation going to be for your end customer? How accurate and trusted is that going to be? And if those 2 answers are positive, which means you're actually applying AI to something that warrants the application of AI, which in our experience discards about 2/3 of startups, AI startups that we see. Then, next you go to like, well, do you have the technical capability of solving it? And in most cases, that's actually yes. In 90% of cases, I'll say. And then you actually begin asking yourself the question of defensibility, right? And to us, we actually look more of the value and uniqueness of the underlying data rather than the technology itself. Like, we think that, for Spotify, I'm sure Spotify has fantastic engineers, but for all I know about machine learning, I think the fact that they have millions of people worldwide, like you and I, curating songs and playlists for the community is actually a lot more high signal than anything else that they can build. So we really ask ourselves, well, is anything on the way that you are building your tool giving you access to data that is not out there anywhere else, and that maybe a horizontal software provider is not going to have? So that's how we think about it.
Yeah, it sounds like you really start at the top of the pyramid with the why question. Why is this a problem that needs to be solved by AI? And if it can be solved by AI, is it a 10x improvement, 100x improvement, or something just menial like 2 or 3 times? And then below that, you go to the team, the data that they have access to, because everything underneath that, the process of dealing with the math side of it and all that is going to be commoditized, as you say. So at the early stage, though, when you don't have the customer validation, how do you determine if the actual team is qualified to do this if this is their first time building an AI startup?
I think in 2 ways. One, they have usually built something. We have invested in 2-person an idea kind of thing, but I would say that is 15% of our investment, not 85% of our investments. And then you actually talk to people. You actually talk to the people they work with before, and you talk to whatever customers they have talked to, because I don't think we have invested in any startup or will invest in any startup where the founder has not done significant customer work. That is just such a red flag.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, we always say, depending on who you're selling to, if it's consumers, you got to have 1,000 people that we can try and talk to. If it's enterprise or SMB, it's 50 and so on and so forth. But no, that makes sense. So, startups often face extreme pushback when selling workflow automation software to legacy industries such as construction, healthcare, and logistics for fear of being replaced by software. How do you advise startups selling to these industries to better deal with change management related pushback issues?
That's a great question. So number one is don't sell software. No one wants to buy software. Very concretely, I think it is unlikely that in one of these legacy industries, the budget line item for IT spending will grow significantly for new products. So you are either replacing an IT vendor or you are solving something that is already in the budget that previously no software was used for, and now you're using software. And that can be consulting services, or it can be paying recruiters, or it can be paying affiliates, or it can be something on marketing, et cetera, et cetera. So beginning with that reality of, hey, do not talk about your technology, do not talk about your software. Just talk about where they're spending money today, because that gives you a pretty good hint of where the problem at, and then solve specifically for that problem and talk against their current solution. And what that needs in order to do that very effectively is that you actually need to have a perfect understanding of what the problem exactly is and how you are competing against the other solutions in their mind. That again, could be software or could be non-software in a lot of these industries. And you have to very concretely be able to articulate why spending money in your particular solution is going to be better, because no matter what, it's going to be a pain replacing it. So you have to be orders of magnitude better, as you said before. And then my second extremely tactical advice is know the org. Like you really, really need to prospect the org really well, really understand where the decision-making power is and where the spending power is. These are big orgs and, they are political and it takes time. And I think you not only have to sell to the problem, but you have to sell to the interests of the specific person in whose power is actually making the buying decision. And I personally, although I was probably told this 10 years ago, and I thought on my mind, I had begun to applying it 10 years ago, I'm still learning how to do that. This is extremely difficult to do.
Yeah, especially in the large, complicated, enterprise sales structures, being very tactile and trying to understand all the moving pieces within the organization, and then going in with the problem, not why your technology is better than everything else out there, and saying, look, I see this as a problem. Do you agree that this is a problem in your organization? Are you spending this much money on solving this? Our ROI is going to be 50% or more better than what you're currently doing. And a lot of the things people don't take into account is the transition or replacing of old softwares to new as a new, sales solution. So that's something I think people need to consider as well, right?
Absolutely. I remember one of my first days at Workday, I had actually never seen Oracle software, and Workday sold it against Oracle. So I took a look at it and I was like, I cannot believe this. Like, why will someone want to work in this Oracle database from the 80s? And then you start to understand why replacement processes take 2 years. And you're like, man, if I was the head of IT at that company, I will not want to undertake that project. What if data gets lost and then I have a problem? And I don't have enough skin in the game for that to happen. And that was a realization that I only had at Workday, although I had been selling enterprise software with Identified for 4 years.
Yeah, I always say to people, the best person to sell to is someone who just joined the company, because they don't know all this, political stuff going on, and they want to impress everyone around them that they brought in a new software. The worst person to pitch at a customer is someone who's been there for so long, who risked losing their job because they took a chance on a startup and the migration didn't go as well. And then the security and compliance department is all up in them. So absolutely agree with that. Well, your team recently led the Series A round in a Ripple Ventures portfolio company, OnCall Health, which we were very excited about to partner with you guys on. What excited you most about the OnCall story, and what are your long-term views on telemedicine's impact on healthcare for the next decade?
Yes, and thank you, Matt, because working with you in making OnCall happen was great, and we are extremely excited. It's interesting because telehealth is a vertical that we had been looking on for a while. One of our first investments 2.5 years ago was the Pill Club, which is also also in the same space. And then in parallel, we had been looking at, people that were delivering business in a box or like business fronts, or Shopify Forex for different industries. And OnCall was at the intersection of that. So we were very familiar, with both the space and the product, and we were very quickly, we were already very much in the understanding of why telehealth and why now and why particularly post-COVID, et cetera, et cetera. That was a no-brainer. And then, we had been looking at several companies in health that were providing the quote-unquote storefront. One of the first things that got our attention with OnCall is that within healthcare, it actually had several sub-verticals where it was doing that successfully. It wasn't just mental health or prescription or other. It had actually several ones. And that already told us, that's interesting, because that is not necessarily straightforward to do. And then when we met the founder, and we saw what an amazing background he had on sales specifically, and how sophisticated he was about thinking about sales processes and the industry and the customer journey, we were extremely excited, because we definitely put this product in the category of, it's complex to build from the process point of view, but it can be built, and the team is quite competent. The adoption is not easy. And you need to have someone which is both passionate about the problem, but extremely good and professional at understanding customer journey, adoption, and sales process. And Nicholas was it. So it was really a quick team decision in which we all got at the company from different points of view, and we're like, we love it.
Well, we're very excited to have you a part of the OnCall family, and we're so happy you see things that we've seen in Nick for the last couple of years, and we're just excited to move forward and build him into one of the largest telemedicine providers globally, along with the team at Base10. So I'd love to move on to my favorite part of the talk, which are your book recommendations, and you have 3 amazing books here. Can you tell us about each one of these and why our audience should give them a read?
Absolutely. So that was a great question, and it was fun, to go back on my Goodreads profile and be like, man, what do I pick for here? These are like selecting among my best friends. So I picked 3 that were very different and important in different points of my life for different reasons. The first one is What is Life from Edwin Schrödinger, who's a physicist, one of the most brilliant minds of the 20th century, known for his CAD thought experiment in quantum mechanics and for the wave equation that essentially explains how to calculate what particles are going to be in quantum mechanics. But this book is not necessarily about physics. It's literally about what is life, which seems like a pretty, dumb question, and one that a physicist has no business answering. And he states that at the beginning. But it's a fascinating journey, and it's a very short book into actually answering from a physical, biological, and philosophical point of view. What does it mean that something is alive? And how do you distinguish something that is alive from non-alive? And what implications does that have in philosophy? I read the book when I was a teenager. I was fascinated, and I remember being one of the first books that I went to my dad and said, hey, this guy, clearly he's about 10x smarter than me, because I've read the book twice, and I think I've understood most things, and I still cannot grasp the implications. It's just so fascinating. With that, I go into the ethics of Spinoza, which I read a few years later, probably about 6 years later, when I was in college. I was actually in law school, and it's a book that I had to study in a class I took in the philosophy of law, and is probably one of the most difficult books to read in terms of how it's written, because this guy, Spinoza, who was a Dutch heretic that decided to try and demonstrate something, which was, hey, can I explain essentially everything about, what life and the universe and human beings, beginning very simple axioms. In particular, he took the geometry of Euclid, right, that explains shapes and areas, beginning with very simple things that we assume, hey, this is a line, and this is how you measure a line. And then from there, you end up being able to measure what is the volume of planet Earth. He wanted to do the same with philosophy. So the book is structured as axioms, and then from there it derives that so and so must be true. extremely ambitious. He probably took that more than any other philosopher. He was in a basement, barely eating for years, coming up with his book, and died very young, excommunicated, mostly hated. And the book has been so influential for so many great thinkers that when Einstein was asked, do you believe in God? He said, I believe in the God of Spinoza, and paraphrasing, not the one up there from the books, but the one that manifested itself on everyday things. And the truth is that I have not seen anyone articulate like Spinoza how everything is connected. And, he was essentially, the conclusion he gets at is that God is everywhere. But he does that, after a series of axioms that are very fun, in my opinion, to go over. And after these two extremely, philosophical and scientific books, I go to one that is extremely practical, The Power Broker. That is actually one of the first books I read when I came to the US. It was recommended by one of my best friends here 12 years ago. And it's about this fascinating and extremely controversial man, Robert Moses, who is the architect of the secret history of New York City. Essentially, he had more influence in building New York City to what it is today, probably more than any other man. And literally, he had more influence in the city that the president had at some point. He managed to control about 12 different public agencies without ever being elected. And essentially, he controlled everything on parks, bridges, tools, because he had this vision of, how the city should be. And he accomplished a lot of things, but in doing so, he also hurt a lot because, as part of his vision, some human beings were better than others. And, he didn't think that fondly of certain groups of immigrants and minorities. And that had consequences that are very palpable in New York City today. And to me, the book illustrates two things. One, how, the best intentions and being fixed on your idea, on your vision, without looking at the realities outside of your bubble can lead to disastrous consequences. And also, yes, very practically, how to get certain things done and where the limits should be of that. So that's my explanation for the three of them.
Wow, those are three amazing books. And I'm shocked that your friend suggested that you read The Power Broker when landing in the US and you decided to still stay. So thanks to your friend for recommending that. Before we wrap up, we always ask our guests for any final words of inspiration for our audience.
I like this dictum that says anything is possible, but not everything is possible. Because, I see it as something very positive. And to me, that is the definition of the importance of focus, right? Because I really think, all things considered, and obviously each of us with our limitations, there is a lot that we can accomplish if we just figure out what is the most important thing to be focused on at any given point. And that is the not everything is possible part if you try everything at the same time.
That's amazing. I love it. Thank you so much for joining me in the tank today, Ade, and sharing your thoughts on investing in automation and AI for the real economy.
Thank you very much, man. A pleasure.